Caleb, this is the most catastrophic mistake you've ever made.
A waste who can't produce an heir only deserves to die in the snow.
I am barren. I have nothing of value to offer.
They are weak fools. You will bear my royal heir, and they will all eventually kneel before you.
She was dragged before the pack and declared barren, thrown into the lethal winter blizzard by the cowardly husband she had spent 3 years protecting. He immediately replaced her with a pregnant mistress, smiling arrogantly as the heavy fortress doors slammed shut against her back. He fully expected her to die quietly in the unforgiving snow. But Caleb made one catastrophic mistake. He did not know the towering, heavily muscled Alpha King of the North was watching from the deep, high-contrast shadows of the tree line. The ruthless warlord with the short dark hair did not look at her and see a broken, useless exile. He saw a breathtakingly beautiful, fiercely resilient queen whose ancient power was simply waiting for a true mate strong enough to awaken it. Within days, the exact woman Caleb cruelly discarded would return to his borders, not as a starving beggar, but as a crowned Luna, carrying the undisputed royal heir of the most dangerous man alive. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The decree of rejection echoed through the stone hall. Silence hung heavy in the vast room. Caleb's voice did not waver as he pronounced her doom. He stood before the packed council with cold indifference. Evelyn knelt on the freezing marble floor. She was stripped of her ceremonial winter cloak. The silver embroidery lay discarded in the dirt. Her crime was spoken aloud for all to hear. She was declared barren. 3 brutal years of mating had produced no heir. The pack demanded strong bloodlines for their future. Evelyn had failed their most basic expectation. Caleb pulled another woman to his side. Her name was Alara. Alara wore a victorious smirk on her lips. Her belly was already swollen with child. A quiet gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. Evelyn's heart shattered against her ribs. She had endured Caleb's cruelty for years in silence. She had managed his territory while he fought petty wars. Now she was discarded like worthless refuse. The elders struck her name from the sacred registry. She was banished to the frozen wastelands. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her. The winter storm howled in greeting. Evelyn walked forward into the blinding snow. She wore only a thin linen dress. The wind bit into her pale skin. Her bare feet bled against the hidden ice. She refused to shed a single tear. Her pride was the only possession Caleb had not stolen. The howling of wild beasts echoed in the distance. Starving rogues hunted in these border woods. A banished female was incredibly easy prey. Evelyn pushed through the deep snowdrifts. Her breathing grew shallow. Her vision began to blur at the edges. Shadows detached themselves from the tree line. 5 mangy wolves began to circle her. Their eyes glowed with feral hunger. Drool dripped from their bared fangs. Evelyn stumbled backward against a frozen pine. Her hands searched the snow-covered ground. She closed her fingers around a heavy branch. She would not die on her knees today. The lead rogue lunged forward with a snarl. A deafening roar shattered the storm. It was unlike the howl of a normal wolf. It was the sound of a living nightmare. The ground trembled beneath Evelyn's feet. A terrifying beast descended from the ridge. His fur was as dark as a starless sky. He tore through the attacking rogues in seconds. Bones snapped loudly in the quiet woods. Hot blood stained the pristine snow. The remaining rogues fled in absolute terror. The victorious wolf slowly turned toward Evelyn. He shifted seamlessly back into human form. The raging wind seemed to bow around him. He was a towering figure of power. Muscles corded across his broad chest. He stood incredibly tall and strong. His short dark hair caught the silver moonlight. Deep shadows sharply defined his rugged jawline. Evelyn recognized his face from the ancient tapestries. This man was Dominic. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. He was a warlord who conquered empires. Rumors said he was an unfeeling monster. Legends claimed he possessed absolutely no heart. Dominic stepped closer to her shivering form. His piercing gaze locked onto her. Evelyn found she could not look away. An intoxicating scent washed over her. It smelled of rain, pine, and pure dominance. The fabled mate bond sparked like wildfire. Dominic halted inches from her frozen body. He looked down at her frail frame. He reached out a scarred hand. His fingers brushed her frozen cheek. The touch sent searing heat rushing through her veins. Evelyn gasped loudly for air. Dominic wrapped his fur cloak around her shoulders. He effortlessly lifted her into his strong arms. She instinctively pressed her face against his warm chest. He spoke for the very first time. His voice was a deep gravelly rumble. They threw away a queen. Evelyn trembled against his chest. I am barren, she whispered with bitter defeat. Dominic's chest vibrated with a dark growl. They are weak fools who do not know a true vessel. He turned and began to walk toward the mountain peak. You will bear my royal heir. Evelyn's tired eyes widened in shock. The Alpha King tightened his protective grip on her. And they will all eventually kneel before you. Evelyn awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of absolute warmth. She was not dead in the snow. She lay upon a massive, carved wooden bed covered in thick, luxurious direwolf furs. A roaring fire crackled fiercely in the stone hearth. It cast deep, dancing shadows against the dark granite walls. The high-contrast lighting made the cavernous room feel both intimate and intensely overwhelming. She slowly pushed herself up against the plush pillows. Her young, beautiful face was pale but completely unmarred by the lethal frost. She looked down and realized she wore a soft, spun silk gown instead of her torn, blooded linen exile dress. The Northern Reaches fortress was known as a place of brutal legends and harsh winters. Yet, her private chamber felt remarkably like a sacred sanctuary. She had braced herself for death, but she had awakened in the heart of absolute power. The heavy oak door creaked open smoothly. 2 female attendants entered with quiet grace. They did not look at her with the pity or sneering disgust she was so used to. Instead, they bowed their heads in deep, genuine reverence. Evelyn pulled the heavy fur blanket up to her chin. She was deeply confused by this unexpected display of respect. For 3 years, Caleb had systematically convinced her she was entirely worthless. A barren woman was considered the lowest rank in any pack hierarchy. Before she could voice a single question, the air in the room suddenly shifted. The atmospheric pressure seemed to drop, heavily saturated with the scent of rain and pine. The maids immediately stepped back and lowered their gazes completely to the floor. Dominic walked into the chamber. He filled the space entirely with his sheer presence. He was incredibly tall and heavily muscled, moving with the silent, deliberate grace of an apex predator. His short dark hair was pushed back, and the flickering firelight carved sharp angles across his rugged, commanding jawline. He wore a simple dark tunic that barely contained the breadth of his shoulders. He dismissed the attendants with a single, slight flick of his hand. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving them entirely alone in the high-contrast shadows. Dominic approached the foot of the bed. His intense, amber gaze locked directly onto her. Evelyn felt her heart race wildly against her ribs. She forced herself to meet his eyes without flinching. She would not cower before him. She was a banished woman with absolutely nothing left to lose. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady in the quiet room. "I have nothing of value to offer an alpha king." Dominic tilted his head slightly. The shadows shifted dynamically across his striking face. "I brought you home," he stated simply. His deep voice resonated physically in her chest. Evelyn let out a bitter, hollow laugh that lacked any real humor. "Home? I am an exile. I am a barren woman." The words tasted like cold ash on her tongue. "Your enemies will eagerly laugh at you. A king needs strong heirs. Do not waste your protection on a broken vessel." In a sudden blur of motion, Dominic was sitting on the very edge of the mattress. His massive frame dwarfed her completely. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently capturing her chin. His thumb brushed softly over her lower lip. The intense heat of his touch sent a violent shiver down her spine. "Never call yourself broken again," he commanded softly, yet the absolute authority in his tone was undeniable and absolute. "It is the undeniable truth," she whispered, her beautiful eyes finally filling with unshed tears. 3 years, Dominic. I gave Caleb 3 long years and produced absolutely nothing." A terrifying, low growl rumbled deep in Dominic's chest at the mere mention of her ex-husband's name. "Caleb is a weak, pathetic whelp," Dominic sneered, his eyes flashing with lethal, predatory danger. "He possesses the diluted blood of a desperate scavenger. A true royal vessel cannot possibly be awakened by dead, toxic soil." He leaned in much closer. His breath brushed warmly against her tear-stained cheek. "You are a vast ocean, Evelyn. You cannot expect a mere puddle to understand your incredible depths. His weakness was the problem, not your resilient body." Evelyn stared at him, her breath completely catching in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her young, beautiful features and seen immense, dormant power instead of a tragic, shameful failure. The emotional weight of his absolute conviction began to systematically shatter the heavy walls of her deep trauma. She felt a profound, sudden shift in her own battered spirit. The sheer resilience that had allowed her to survive the deadly blizzard was now blooming into something fiercely triumphant. "The mate bond does not lie," Dominic continued, his voice dropping to a dark, hypnotic cadence. "I can smell the pure, ancient vitality pulsing fiercely through your veins. You were never barren, my beautiful mate." He moved his hand down, his palm resting lightly but possessively against her flat stomach through the thin silk gown. The heat radiating from his touch was incredibly intense, sparking a deep, primal ache low in her belly. Your body was simply waiting for an alpha strong enough to actually claim it. An alpha who could withstand your fierce fire without burning to ash. Tears finally spilled over Evelyn's long eyelashes. They were not tears of sorrow or grief, but of an overwhelming, terrifying hope. She looked at this towering, imposing man. He was a warlord actively feared by entire nations, yet he touched her as if she were his most precious, invaluable treasure. "Rest now, my queen," Dominic whispered reverently, pressing a slow, burning kiss to her forehead. "Tomorrow, the entire northern reaches will formally meet their Luna. And very soon, we will show your pathetic former pack exactly what they foolishly threw away." The neutral border territory was a desolate expanse of jagged black rock. Bitter winds swept relentlessly across the landscape, howling against the heavy canvas of the diplomatic pavilion. Inside, rows of large iron braziers burned fiercely to fight the lethal cold. They cast stark, high-contrast shadows that danced wildly across the woven floor rugs, creating an atmosphere of intense, inescapable pressure. Caleb stood near the center of the negotiation table in his finest ceremonial leather armor. He carried himself with the blind arrogance of a man who believed his position was entirely unassailable. His pack faced a brutal winter famine, and their stores were nearly empty. He desperately needed to secure a vital trade treaty for grain from the wealthy northern territories. He expected to easily manipulate a minor border official into agreeing to his completely selfish terms. Alara stood closely by his side, draped heavily in expensive red velvet. Her hands rested protectively over her slightly rounded belly. A smug smirk played continuously on her lips as she fully embraced her role as the new Luna. She whispered soft praises to Caleb, feeding his already inflated ego with empty promises. They believed their union would bring unprecedented glory to the southern valleys. They spared no thought for the quiet woman they had left to freeze in the unforgiving wilderness. The heavy canvas entrance flaps were suddenly thrown open with violent force. The freezing northern gale flooded the room, instantly extinguishing half the torches. The remaining flames flickered frantically, casting dramatic, elongated shadows. Four massive royal guards marched inside in perfect unison. Their polished steel armor gleamed in the dim light as they fanned out silently to secure the perimeter. Dominic stepped smoothly over the threshold. He immediately commanded the entire space with his sheer, undeniable physical presence. He was a towering, heavily muscled apex predator moving with lethal grace. His short dark hair framed a rugged face carved into sharp, unforgiving angles by the firelight. The flickering flames highlighted a highly dangerous, predatory glint in his amber eyes. The atmospheric pressure dropped abruptly in the tent. Caleb instinctively stepped backward as his hollow arrogance dissolved into sudden panic. The legendary Alpha King had come personally to the border. Dominic ignored the trembling southern Alpha completely. He stopped and extended his scarred hand gently toward the dark doorway. A profound, heavy silence descended upon the pavilion. A delicate, graceful hand emerged from the deep shadows and slipped firmly into his massive palm. Evelyn stepped confidently into the golden light. Caleb felt the breath leave his lungs as if he had taken a brutal physical blow. He blinked rapidly against the impossible sight standing directly before him. This was the exact woman he had banished mere days ago, yet she was utterly transformed. The broken, shivering exile was gone completely, replaced by a devastating vision of pure royalty. She wore a breathtaking gown of midnight blue silk. Intricate silver threads depicting wild wolves climbed the elegant bodice. A magnificent crown of forged black iron and raw diamonds rested perfectly upon her head. She radiated a fierce, ancient vitality that washed over the room in a palpable, intoxicating wave. The absolute power of the northern reaches flowed vibrantly through her flawless posture. Alara let out a choked gasp. Her smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a pale mask of desperate, ugly jealousy. She stared openly at the regal queen standing before them. The stark contrast between Alara's common velvet and Evelyn's majestic aura was absolutely devastating to witness. "Evelyn?" Caleb whispered into the tense silence. His voice cracked pathetically, betraying a miserable mix of profound shock and disbelief. He stared directly at the glowing, permanent mark of the royal mate bond freshly scarred into her elegant neck. A terrifying growl rattled the thick wooden support poles. Dominic stepped aggressively in front of his mate. His amber eyes burned with unapologetic, murderous fury. "You will address her strictly as your queen," he commanded. His gravelly voice echoed through the space with the dark promise of imminent violence. Evelyn placed her hand on Dominic's arm to smoothly soothe his rage. She stepped elegantly out from behind his massive shadow. She looked directly at Caleb with absolute, chilling indifference. There was no pain, no sorrow, and no lingering affection in her steady gaze. She looked at him as if he were nothing but worthless dust beneath her exquisite shoes. "You came begging for our winter grain, Alpha Caleb," Evelyn stated calmly. Her voice was cold, authoritative, and completely devoid of any past connection. Caleb's fragile reality shattered irreparably in that exact moment. The suffocating weight of his catastrophic mistake crashed down heavily upon his shoulders. He had not merely banished a useless wife. He had foolishly discarded a true vessel of immense ancient power. Now, the very survival of his starving pack rested entirely in her unforgiving hands. The heavy obsidian doors of the northern war room swung open with a resounding thud. High-contrast lighting from the massive iron chandelier cast sharp, intimidating shadows across the expansive stone map table. The northern elders, battle-hardened and deeply scarred, fell into immediate silence as Dominic entered. The Alpha King was a towering, heavily muscled force of nature. His short dark hair was impeccably neat, contrasting sharply with the savage, predatory aura that constantly surrounded him. He took his rightful place at the head of the table, his sheer physical presence demanding absolute submission from the fiercest warriors in the realm. Evelyn walked into the room quietly a moment later. She was undeniably young and breathtakingly beautiful, her resilient spirit shining clearly through her composed, regal posture. She wore a tailored dark velvet gown that accentuated her graceful movements, the fresh royal mate mark highly visible on her delicate neck. A quiet murmur rippled through the war room. The northern elders deeply respected Dominic's terrifying strength, but they clearly viewed this exiled southern bride merely as a necessary vessel for a royal heir. They did not yet understand the sharp, tactical mind hidden beneath her flawless exterior. An elder named Valerus stepped forward, his weathered expression etched with deep skepticism. He aggressively slapped a rolled parchment onto the granite table. He argued loudly that the southern valleys were completely destitute and starving. He heavily insisted the northern reaches should conquer Caleb's weakened territory outright instead of trading precious winter grain. He dismissed Caleb as a pathetic, desperate beggar, calling him easy prey for their vastly superior military might. Dominic's amber eyes narrowed dangerously, a low, rumbling growl building steadily in his broad chest. He was completely ready to fiercely defend his mate's honor from the elder's subtle disrespect. But Evelyn gently placed her soft hand over his massive, scarred knuckles. She silently asked him to let her handle this challenge. She stepped confidently up to the massive stone table, her unwavering gaze sweeping the room with chilling authority. "You are gravely underestimating a coward's desperate cunning," Evelyn stated calmly, her voice slicing through the heavy tension like a forged silver blade. She leaned over the tactical map, her slender finger tracing the jagged southern border with absolute precision. "Caleb is not merely starving. He is intentionally hoarding his remaining grain reserves in the hidden cavern silos near the Whispering Ridge." The entire war room fell into an immediate, stunned silence. Evelyn looked directly into Valerus's eyes with a predatory calmness that mirrored her powerful mate. "I managed that miserable territory for 3 brutal years while he played at petty border wars. Caleb is projecting absolute ruin to secure our resources, but he is secretly funding a mercenary army of rogue wolves in the eastern marshlands. If you march your elite warriors into his valley now, you will walk blindly into a devastating, bloody ambush." Valerus blinked rapidly, completely caught off guard by her precise, undeniable tactical knowledge. He looked toward Dominic for confirmation. The Alpha King leaned back in his heavy iron chair, a profoundly dark, fiercely proud smile pulling at the corner of his lips. The flickering firelight carved sharp, striking angles into his rugged jaw. He looked at his young, beautiful mate as if she had just flawlessly conquered the entire world for him. "My queen has spoken," Dominic rumbled deeply, the absolute authority in his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We will not march blindly. We will completely sever their eastern supply lines tonight and let Caleb slowly drown in his own treacherous lies." Meanwhile, miles away in the freezing border camp, Caleb paced frantically inside his dim canvas tent. The image of Evelyn, radiant and completely untouchable beside the towering Alpha King, burned painfully in his frantic mind. He had foolishly discarded a brilliant strategic genius and an incredibly powerful royal vessel for a petty, vain mistress. Absolute desperation clawed fiercely at his throat. He realized he could never defeat Dominic in open combat, nor could he outsmart Evelyn's intricate knowledge of his own vulnerable lands. A dark, Poisonous thoughts suddenly took root in his crumbling mind. If he could not have her back through negotiation, he would simply have to steal her in the dead of night, or his entire pack would face absolute annihilation. The winter night fell heavily over the northern reaches fortress. A supernatural blizzard entirely masked the approach of desperate men. Caleb had emptied his final remaining vaults to hire the Blood Moon mercenaries. These were ruthless rogue wolves actively banished from every civilized territory. Their orders were explicitly clear and completely desperate. They were to bypass the heavy outer defenses, silently infiltrate the royal wing, and forcefully extract the newly crowned Luna. Caleb foolishly believed Dominic's brief departure to the eastern border left Evelyn completely vulnerable. He still viewed her as the submissive, helpless woman he had repeatedly crushed for 3 long years. He did not realize the profound transformation the ancient mate bond had triggered within her soul. Evelyn sat alone in the dim firelight of the grand library. She wore a simple dark velvet gown that beautifully highlighted her young, striking features. The towering Alpha King had left only hours ago. Dominic had pressed a burning kiss to her forehead before riding out with his elite guard. He promised to sever the southern supply lines by dawn. He had assigned a dozen seasoned warriors to heavily guard her oak door. Evelyn, however, knew Caleb's cowardly tactics better than anyone alive. She anticipated he would absolutely avoid a direct frontal assault. He would use the hidden servant tunnels running deep beneath the ancient stone foundation. She had spent the entire afternoon studying the complex fortress blueprints. The thick stone walls suddenly echoed with a faint, unnatural scratching sound. It was the distinct noise of steel forcing a hidden lock. Evelyn did not panic or scream for the guards stationed outside. She calmly stood up and walked toward the massive iron candelabra. She extinguished all but a single flickering candle. The expansive library plunged into deep, high-contrast shadows. She moved silently to the elevated gallery overlooking the main floor. Her heart beat with a steady, incredibly resilient rhythm. She was a true northern queen now, and queens did not cower in the dark. 6 massive rogue mercenaries slipped silently from behind a rotating bookshelf. Their glowing eyes burned with unnatural feral hunger. They held poisoned daggers tightly in their unwashed hands. The lead mercenary signaled the others to spread out across the silent room. They smelled the intoxicating scent of rain and pine lingering heavily in the air. They thought their prize was trapped helplessly somewhere in the vast darkness. They moved with lethal intent toward the large velvet armchair near the stone hearth. Evelyn stood high above them on the wrought iron balcony. She gripped a heavy silver mechanism attached directly to the grand chandelier. Caleb always sends feral dogs to do a true wolf's job, she stated calmly. Her voice was cold, echoing ominously through the cavernous space. The mercenaries snapped their heads upward in pure shock. Before they could react to her precise location, Evelyn aggressively pulled the heavy lever. The massive iron chandelier detached violently from the high ceiling. It crashed down with devastating force directly onto the interlopers. The floorboards shattered perfectly under the immense weight. 2 rogues were crushed instantly beneath the unforgiving iron. The remaining scattered in absolute panic. The heavy oak doors burst open simultaneously. The northern guards poured into the room with drawn broadswords. A terrifying roar suddenly shook the very foundation of the fortress. It was a sound that froze the blood in every living vein. Dominic strode aggressively through the shattered doorway. He had returned much earlier than anticipated. The Alpha King was a towering, heavily muscled force of pure destruction. His short dark hair was wild from the brutal winter wind. His amber eyes burned with absolute, unhinged fury. He saw the remaining mercenaries cornered like pathetic rats. He did not bother drawing a weapon. He simply tore through them with his bare hands. Bones snapped loudly in the suffocating silence that followed the slaughter. Dominic threw the final mercenary against the stone wall with lethal force. The intruder slumped to the floor, completely broken. The Alpha King stood amidst the carnage, his broad chest heaving powerfully. He immediately searched the dark room for his mate. He found Evelyn descending the spiral staircase with absolute regal grace. She was completely unharmed and breathtakingly composed. Dominic closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He pulled her fiercely into his broad chest, burying his face deep in her neck. He inhaled her scent deeply to calm the murderous rage boiling inside him. Evelyn wrapped her arms tightly around his waist. "I told you Caleb was a desperate coward," she whispered softly against his thundering heart. Dominic pulled back slightly to look at her beautiful, young face. The high-contrast firelight illuminated the fierce, unbroken spirit shining vibrantly in her eyes. He realized she had orchestrated the entire trap flawlessly. She had lured the assassins directly into her kill zone. A dark, incredibly proud smile spread slowly across his rugged face. He kissed her deeply, branding her soul with his absolute devotion. "You are the most dangerous creature in this entire kingdom," he rumbled. The surviving Northern Guards immediately knelt before their Luna. They had witnessed her incredible tactical brilliance firsthand. They finally understood why the Alpha King revered this exiled woman so deeply. She was not just a vessel for a royal bloodline. She was a lethal strategist who could ruthlessly protect her own crown. News of this catastrophic failure would reach the starving southern valleys by dawn. Caleb's foolish gamble had cost him his most expensive mercenaries. It had also completely humiliated him before the entire werewolf realm. The northern reaches were more united and dangerous than ever before. Evelyn stood tall beside her towering Alpha King. They were an unstoppable force forged entirely in fire and ice. The Great Hall of the Southern Valleys was no longer a place of pride, warmth, or authority. The heavy stone walls seemed to physically close in, trapping the bitter, freezing wind that whistled mercilessly through the cracked timber roof. A single, dying fire fought a losing battle against the overwhelming darkness in the massive stone hearth. It cast long, erratic, high-contrast shadows that danced violently across the empty, dusty banquet tables. Caleb sat slumped heavily on his intricately carved wooden throne. The devastating news had arrived just minutes before the frozen dawn. His incredibly expensive, desperate gamble had failed completely. The Blood Moon mercenaries were utterly slaughtered, and Dominic's elite northern forces had permanently severed the vital eastern supply routes. The southern valleys were now completely isolated, entirely bankrupt, and rapidly starving. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall burst open with a violent, resounding crash. The freezing winter gale swept viciously into the dim room, instantly extinguishing the few remaining torches. 7 southern elders marched forcefully inside, their deeply weathered faces hardened by raw desperation and boiling, unadulterated fury. They did not bow their heads or offer the customary signs of submission to their reigning alpha. Instead, they formed a tight, heavily intimidating semicircle directly around the raised royal dais. Caleb instinctively shrank backward against his cold wooden seat. In that terrifying moment of absolute vulnerability, his frantic mind suddenly recalled the towering, heavily muscled form of the Northern Alpha King. Dominic, with his meticulously neat short dark hair and absolute, terrifying power, had commanded an entire room merely by taking a single breath. Caleb, in stark, pathetic contrast, felt incredibly small and utterly powerless. Elder Gideon stepped aggressively forward from the high-contrast shadows. His hollow, sunken eyes burned with the unmistakable fire of absolute mutiny. He reached into his thick fur coat and threw a cracked, blood-stained mercenary emblem directly onto the stone floor at Caleb's trembling feet. The heavy silver clattered loudly, breaking the tense, suffocating silence of the freezing hall. Gideon did not bother to shout, but his quiet, gravelly voice carried a highly lethal edge. He ruthlessly accused Caleb of dragging their entire innocent pack into a suicidal war against an invincible, merciless enemy. He publicly exposed the cowardly, pathetic lie Caleb had told them all regarding his former mate. Caleb had aggressively claimed Evelyn was a useless, broken, barren exile. Now, the entire supernatural continent knew the undeniable truth. She was a brilliant, exceptionally young, and beautiful Luna who commanded the absolute, deadly devotion of the fiercest warlord in existence. They had foolishly thrown away a true queen for absolutely nothing. Alara rushed hastily out from the private royal chambers, her young face entirely pale with rapidly rising panic. She wore her thick, incredibly expensive red velvet robes, clinging desperately to the fading, pathetic illusion of her superior social status. She placed her trembling hands protectively over her slightly swollen belly and shoved herself firmly between Caleb and the highly furious elders. She shrilly reminded them that she currently carried the true, undisputed future of the Southern Pack. She aggressively demanded their immediate, unwavering loyalty to the next Southern Alpha heir. Her desperate, breaking voice cracked sharply, echoing pathetically against the unforgiving cold stone walls. She fully expected them to immediately back down in total submission, just as they always had when she arrogantly paraded her highly prized pregnancy before the starving commoners. Gideon looked at Alara with absolute, freezing disgust that chilled her straight to the bone. He slowly shook his grey head, his hardened face illuminated sharply by the dying, red embers in the massive hearth. He stated brutally that a starving pack could not possibly eat a royal title, nor could a single infant stop the devastating, lethal northern winter that was currently freezing their children. He pointed a trembling, incredibly angry finger directly at Caleb's chest. He declared loudly that Caleb's weak, entirely diluted bloodline had brought them nothing but absolute, catastrophic ruin. Evelyn had silently and gracefully carried the massive, crushing weight of their territory's survival for 3 brutal years, and Caleb had thoughtlessly discarded her merely to satisfy his own pathetic, fragile ego. Now, every single member of the Southern Valleys was going to pay the ultimate, bloody price for his blind, breathtaking arrogance. The inescapable physical reality of his complete destruction finally crashed down violently onto Caleb's shoulders. The pack mutiny was absolute, legally binding, and entirely irreversible. The tribal elders formally invoked the ancient, sacred right of primal survival. With a series of heavily spoken oaths, they systematically stripped Caleb of his alpha title, his military command, and his absolute legal authority. They officially declared him a grave, active danger to his own people. Caleb fell heavily to his knees on the freezing stone floor, his shaking hands gripping his hair in sheer, unadulterated agony. Alara collapsed completely beside him, sobbing hysterically into the cold dirt as her grand, heavily delusional dreams of ultimate power dissolved instantly into terrifying dust. They were no longer royalty in the Southern Valleys. They were now the absolute bottom of the pack hierarchy, trapped hopelessly in a starving, freezing prison entirely of their own making. The heavy oak doors of the royal chamber clicked shut, sealing the outside world away entirely. High-contrast firelight danced aggressively across the massive stone hearth, pushing deep, dramatic shadows into the far corners of the cavernous room. Evelyn stood quietly by the frosted glass window, her dark velvet gown cascading softly against the cold marble floor. She was young, incredibly beautiful, and vibrantly alive with a newly discovered power. The royal messenger had arrived just an hour ago with the final, definitive reports from the starving Southern Valleys. Caleb was officially stripped of his rank, his pack mutiny absolute and irreversible. The heavy, suffocating chain of her past trauma finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the crisp scent of oncoming snow and realizing she was finally, completely free. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted suddenly, growing thick and heavy with the intoxicating scent of rain and pine. Dominic stepped smoothly out of the deep shadows. He had discarded his heavy steel armor, wearing only a loose dark linen shirt that stretched taut across his incredibly broad chest. The Alpha King was towering, his heavily muscled frame moving with the silent, deliberate grace of a lethal predatory beast. His short dark hair was slightly damp from the brutal winter wind outside. He walked slowly toward her, his amber eyes burning with an intense, unwavering devotion that still managed to steal the very breath directly from her lungs. "It is finished," Dominic rumbled quietly, his deep voice vibrating profoundly through the stone floor beneath her feet. "The southern border is entirely sealed. Those weak fools will never speak your royal name in disrespect again." Evelyn turned completely away from the freezing window. She closed the distance between them without a single moment of hesitation, placing her soft palms flat against his solid, unyielding chest. She felt the steady, incredibly powerful rhythm of his heart beating exclusively for her. "I spent 3 brutal years believing I was fundamentally broken," she whispered, her voice steady and remarkably clear in the quiet room. "I let a weak, cowardly man convince me I held absolutely no value to our kind." Dominic raised a large, heavily scarred hand and gently cupped her warm cheek. His thumb brushed softly over her lower lip, his touch immediately igniting a fierce, undeniable heat deep within her veins. "You were never broken, my resilient queen. You were a dormant, incredibly powerful volcano trapped beneath worthless, frozen dirt. You merely required a fire strong enough to finally wake you without burning to ash." He leaned down and captured her lips in a fiercely possessive, soul-shattering kiss. The ancient mate bond flared violently between them, instantly becoming a tangible, burning current of pure magical energy. Evelyn did not hesitate or pull away. She leaned heavily into his towering physical strength, her hands sliding up to grip his broad, powerful shoulders. She felt the very last remaining shards of her toxic self-doubt dissolve instantly in the sheer, overwhelming heat of his absolute claim. Dominic effortlessly lifted her off the cold stone floor, carrying her smoothly toward the massive, fur-covered bed securely positioned in the center of the chamber. The intense firelight carved sharp, rugged angles into his jawline as he laid her gently back against the plush direwolf pelts. He looked down at her young, striking face with a profound reverence usually reserved strictly for ancient gods. He did not rush the moment. He worshipped every single inch of her skin, his touch both dangerously powerful and incredibly, heartbreakingly tender. The dark shadows danced wildly across the high ceiling as their souls finally merged in complete, undeniable totality. When Dominic finally claimed her completely, a blinding, physical rush of pure, ancient power exploded violently through Evelyn's veins. It was not merely a physical union, it was a massive cosmic alignment of 2 dominant, undeniable natural forces. She gasped loudly, her back arching off the heavy furs as a searing, glowing golden heat pooled heavily and permanently in her lower abdomen. The royal mate mark scarred onto her elegant neck glowed fiercely in the dim light, burning with the sudden, undeniable promise of new, royal life. Dominic held her fiercely against his broad chest as the powerful surge of ancient energy slowly subsided into a comforting, steady hum. Both of them were breathing heavily, their bodies slick with sweat in the incredibly warm, secure room. He pressed his large, warm palm firmly against her flat stomach, his glowing amber eyes shining with an overwhelming, terrifying awe. "I can feel the pulse," he whispered, his deep voice unexpectedly thick with raw, unadulterated emotion. The legendary warlord, the heavily feared monster of the ruthless north, buried his face deep into her neck and let out a shuddering, reverent breath. "The ancient royal bloodline awakens. You successfully carry my heir, Evelyn." Tears of absolute, pure joy spilled over her long eyelashes, tracking silently down her heavily flushed cheeks. The ultimate prophecy of her true nature was finally fulfilled. She was not the tragic, barren exile left to die alone in the brutal winter snow. She was the absolute beating heart of the northern reaches, a resilient, incredibly powerful Luna who had just permanently cemented the future of the greatest empire on Earth. She wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, pulling his towering frame fiercely against her own beating heart. The tragic, painful chapter of her life was permanently closed forever, and her reign of absolute, undisputed glory had officially begun. The grand winter plaza of the northern reaches was a breathtaking marvel of ancient, brutal architecture, carved directly into the living black stone of the unforgiving mountain. Tonight, the massive expanse was illuminated by hundreds of towering iron piers. The intense, high-contrast firelight violently fought back the encroaching darkness of the raging blizzard, casting incredibly sharp, dancing shadows across the hardened faces of 10,000 gathered warriors. The atmospheric pressure in the massive square was impossibly heavy, vibrating with a palpable, electric anticipation. Every pack leader, elite royal guard, and sovereign noble from across the frozen continent had answered the Alpha King's absolute, undeniable summons. They stood in perfect, disciplined silence, their warm breath pluming thickly in the freezing winter air, waiting anxiously to bear witness to a truly historic ascension. Evelyn stood quietly at the very base of the towering obsidian steps. She took a slow, deeply steadying breath, letting the crisp, freezing wind fill her resilient lungs. She wore a magnificent ceremonial gown woven entirely from dark silver silk and midnight velvet, heavily embroidered with the ancient, sacred runes of the royal bloodline. The heavy fabric flowed gracefully around her elegant frame, beautifully highlighting her remarkably young, breathtakingly striking features. Yet, it was the fierce, unbroken fire shining vibrantly in her profound gaze that truly commanded absolute, unwavering attention. She was no longer the shivering, broken exile cast aside ruthlessly in the deep snow. She was a devastating, unstoppable force of nature, a woman who had walked bravely through the absolute darkest depths of betrayal and emerged forged in pure, unbreakable steel. At the very summit of the grand stone staircase stood Dominic. The Alpha King was a towering, heavily muscled god of war standing majestically amidst the flickering, dramatic light. He wore ceremonial combat armor of forged black steel that perfectly accentuated the terrifying, immense breadth of his chest and broad shoulders. His short dark hair was impeccably neat, catching the golden, shifting glow of the raging fires. His rugged, sharply angular jawline was set in an expression of absolute, unyielding authority. When his piercing amber eyes finally locked onto Evelyn's approaching form, the terrifying, merciless warlord vanished completely from his terrifying visage. In his intense gaze, there was only a profound, universe-altering devotion. He slowly extended his massive, heavily scarred hand toward her, issuing a silent, absolute command for her to finally take her rightful place eternally by his side. Evelyn ascended the dark stone steps with slow, incredibly deliberate grace. With every single upward movement, she mentally severed yet another invisible, toxic chain from her painful, discarded past. She reached the expansive summit and slipped her delicate, pale hand firmly into Dominic's massive, waiting grasp. The sheer, intoxicating heat of his immediate touch sent a powerful, undeniable shockwave of energy through her veins, a brilliant physical manifestation of their unbreakable, ancient mate bond. Dominic smoothly and possessively pulled her close to his massive frame, providing an impenetrable, towering fortress of absolute warmth against the biting northern gale. He slowly turned to face the vast, endless sea of waiting faces. The absolute silence in the expansive plaza deepened significantly, becoming so profoundly heavy that the fierce crackling of the massive fires sounded exactly like rolling thunder. Dominic slowly raised his right hand, holding the ancient, forged iron crown of the legendary Northern Luna. It was a brutal, starkly beautiful artifact, completely devoid of delicate, useless jewels, crafted instead from the unbreakable, dark metal of fallen stars. He turned completely to Evelyn, his amber gaze holding an overwhelming, deeply sacred reverence. He slowly and deliberately lowered the heavy iron crown onto her head. It rested perfectly against her dark hair, a heavy, undeniable, and permanent symbol of her absolute authority over the realm. "You are the vital beating heart of the North," he rumbled softly, yet his deeply resonant voice carried flawlessly across the frozen, silent plaza. "You are the undeniable, eternal fire that permanently keeps the devastating winter at bay." He then turned his fierce, glowing amber eyes back to the massive, anticipating crowd. He drew in her incredibly deep, powerful breath, his broad, heavily armored chest expanding massively. "Behold your true queen!" Dominic roared, the sheer, terrifying volume of his commanding voice physically shaking the very stone foundations of the mountain. "Behold the true, ancient vessel of the undisputed royal bloodline. The ancient mate bond is absolute, and the gods have firmly and permanently spoken. Evelyn of the Northern Reaches currently carries the royal heir." For a single, perfectly suspended heartbeat, the entire frozen world seemed to hold its collective breath. Then, the immense plaza absolutely erupted with cataclysmic force. 10,000 battle-hardened warriors slammed their heavy steel broadswords aggressively against their iron shields in perfect, incredibly deafening unison. The metallic roar of absolute, unquestioning loyalty completely shattered the quiet winter night. The deafening, earth-shattering cheers echoed violently across the jagged mountain peaks, creating a terrifying, unstoppable wave of sound that would inevitably reach the starving, broken remnants of the pathetic southern valleys. The sheer acoustic force of their total devotion was physically overwhelming. Evelyn looked out over the vast, fiercely cheering army. She felt the warm, glowing presence of the powerful new life already taking firm root deep within her womb. She leaned back safely against Dominic's towering, muscular chest, wrapping her slender fingers tightly around his scarred hand. She had finally claimed her throne, her undeniable revenge, and her absolute, brilliant destiny. The harsh, unforgiving winter that had brutally defined the Northern Reaches for centuries finally surrendered to the undeniable warmth of a vibrant, triumphant spring. High-contrast beams of golden sunlight pierced deeply through the massive stained-glass windows of the royal nursery, casting intricate, colorful shadows across the polished black marble floor. Evelyn sat gracefully in a heavily carved rocking chair of dark mahogany. She wore a simple, elegant gown of soft white linen that draped perfectly over her youthful, breathtakingly beautiful frame. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders as she looked down at the tiny, perfect life resting securely in her arms. The royal heir of the Northern Reaches had been born at the exact moment the final winter storm broke. He possessed his father's dark hair and his mother's fiercely resilient spirit. Evelyn traced the infant's soft cheek with a delicate finger, her heart swelling with an overwhelming, profound peace that completely eclipsed the brutal trauma of her discarded past. The heavy oak door opened with a quiet, deliberate click. Dominic stepped into the sunlit sanctuary. The Alpha King remained a towering, heavily muscled force of nature, his broad chest and powerful shoulders moving with the fluid, silent grace of an apex predator. His short dark hair caught the bright golden light, temporarily softening the rugged, incredibly sharp angles of his intimidating jawline. He had recently returned from a final, decisive border patrol, permanently securing their rapidly expanding territory. He quickly stripped off his heavy steel gauntlets and approached his mate with a quiet, deeply sacred reverence. When he looked at Evelyn and the sleeping infant, the terrifying warlord who had violently conquered the supernatural continent dissolved entirely. He knelt smoothly beside the rocking chair, his massive frame dwarfing the furniture completely. He reached out with a scarred, battle-hardened hand, gently resting his large palm against the back of the baby's tiny head. "The High Council has formally recognized his absolute birthright," Dominic rumbled softly, his deep voice vibrating with a fierce, unwavering pride that resonated in the quiet room. "The entire realm is celebrating. They have lit the massive mountain beacons from the eastern shores to the western peaks. Our legacy is completely secured, my beautiful queen." Evelyn smiled warmly, leaning her head naturally against Dominic's broad, powerful shoulder. She felt the intoxicating, deeply grounding scent of rain and pine wash over her, a permanent, physical reminder of the ancient mate bond that had completely saved her life. "They celebrate the terrifying strength of their Alpha King," she whispered, her voice incredibly steady and clear. "But they will quickly learn the absolute resilience of their young prince. He is born of the harsh winter snow and the unbreakable northern iron. Miles away, in the desolate, heavily muddy ruins of the southern valleys, Caleb pushed a broken wooden cart through the freezing slush. He was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, polished alpha who had once callously banished his highly loyal wife. He wore ragged, filthy clothes, his body gaunt and severely weakened by months of brutal famine and relentless forced labor. Alara had long since abandoned him, fleeing desperately into the dangerous rogue lands when her false promises of a strong royal heir resulted only in a frail, sickly child that the newly elected pack leaders completely rejected. Caleb paused his agonizing work, his aching muscles screaming in pure physical agony, and looked toward the distant, towering peaks of the northern reaches. The sky above the massive mountains was brilliantly illuminated by the massive, triumphant celebration beacons. He knew exactly what those fires meant. The news of the northern heir's birth had spread across the continent like wildfire. Caleb fell heavily to his knees in the cold, unforgiving mud. The crushing, inescapable weight of his catastrophic failure finally broke his miserable spirit completely. He had arrogantly thrown away a brilliant, powerful goddess for absolute, eternal ruin. Back in the sun-drenched royal nursery, Dominic stood up and effortlessly lifted Evelyn into his incredibly strong arms, keeping the newborn safely and warmly nestled between them. He carried her smoothly toward the expansive stone balcony that directly overlooked the vast, thriving capital city. The high-contrast sunlight washed over them entirely, illuminating the absolute, unyielding devotion burning fiercely in the Alpha King's amber eyes. Evelyn rested her head against his powerfully muscled chest, listening to the steady, comforting, and eternal rhythm of his beating heart. She looked out over the impenetrable stone fortress and the fiercely cheering masses gathered in the plaza below. The agonizing, shameful label of the barren, discarded exile was completely dead, buried forever beneath the heavy winter snow. She was Evelyn, the fiercely resilient, universally beloved Luna of the northern reaches, the proud mother of the future king, and the eternal, beating heart of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Their reign of profound strength and absolute devotion was destined to last for 1,000 unbroken years.